next on the program is Jeremy Kinley, who is going to be speaking about the 10 years Snowy Water licence review, the submissions that were received and the themes, and I think a sort of a mini public consultation version, which the Alliance went to a couple of months ago in Cooma. So just to provide that feedback to you. Now, Jeremy is managing the New South Wales Government's 10-year review of the Snowy Water Licence. He's an environmental engineer with over 14 years experience in water policy and planning in the public sector, specialising in water allocation, river operations and environmental water delivery. This included a stint as the Victorian representative on the Snowy Water Consultation Liaison Committee. Jeremy has only recently joined the Department of Industry and Water a year ago, moving from Melbourne, and he's based in Queanbeyan. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. Can everyone hear me okay? I've got quite a low voice. Thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be here, and yeah, I think I'm using this opportunity as a bit of a public information session because we didn't get, a lot of people at the Cooma session, unfortunately, and probably partly my fault for a lack of advertising. But anyway, we're here today, and it's a really good opportunity to present. Garner mentioned, some of the issues that we've heard from stakeholders throughout the Snowy Water Licence Review, and also present how we're proposing to respond. Also, I'd like to thank the Snowy River Alliance for inviting me here today too. But before I start, just like to acknowledge traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today in Ngarago, pay my respect to elders past, present and elders and emerging, and also elders from other communities who may be here today. So given the focus of today's event being around the Snowy River, I've tailored my presentation really around the environmental flows. Firstly, set the scene by providing some context to the review, talk a little bit about the Snowy Water Licence itself and what the terms of reference of the review is, talk then a little bit about the stakeholder input, what we've heard, like I mentioned before, and then work through and outline some of the proposals that we've put forward in the draft report. And finally, I'll finish up by presenting how we're proposing to, roll out some of those recommendations. Okay, so the licence, if you don't know, it's the key, legal instrument that governs how water is managed within the Snowy scheme. It defines Snowy Hydro's rights and obligations to all water within the scheme. And it aims to strike a balance between competing demands on the water for electricity generation, as well as the environmental use and consumptive use out west in the Murray-Darling Basin. It was issued in 2002, and it's a 75-year term, and it was done as part of the corporatisation of the scheme back then, and essentially allows Snowy Hydro to collect, store, control every single drop of water it can access within the scheme. It includes obligations on Snowy Hydro to release water to the Murray and Murrumbidgee rivers, and that's the annual release requirements, and it also imposes environmental obligations or environmental water obligations on the corporation as well, down the Snowy River, Murray River, and also some of the montane rivers within the Snowy Mountains, and also the Murrumbidgee River below Tantangara Dam. It's granted and managed by, for all intents and purposes, Department of Industry Water, but on behalf of what's called the Water Administration Ministerial Corporation, and I'll refer to that institution, or whatever it is, that body, as Ministerial Corporation from now on, I think. But yeah, for all intents and purposes, the department oversees and administers the licence and works with Snowy Hydro. Okay, so the review. So the licence itself is actually subject to mandatory reviews. Initially after 5 years, that was the focus of environmental obligations under the licence, and then every 10 years thereafter. This is the first 10-year review we've held. The terms of reference are pretty well set out in the licence, and they're up there. So they're focused on the obligations under the licence, and we're also looking at Snowy Hydro's performance in meeting the conditions of the licence to date as well. So that's something extra we're looking at. What it isn't covering is things about the volume of water recovered for the Snowy River, how environmental flows are planned, implications of Snowy 2.0, environmental monitoring, things like that. The Australian government purchase of Snowy Hydro itself. I think that's important. What have we heard? We received overall to date 40 submissions to the review, which I think's pretty impressive. It's a water licence. It's not a significant regional plan, and it's great because we think that stakeholder and expert knowledge is vital to a successful outcome in this stuff, and we're committed to listening and working through some solutions that really get some beneficial outcomes. In the first round, we called for submissions when we kicked the review off, which was, I think it was in July last year. I wasn't on board, but we received 24 submissions in that first round from Snowy Hydro itself and a range of environmental, community groups, agricultural groups from the West and governments as well. We recorded from those submissions close to 240, statements or issues overall, which kind of covered around 50 topics. And around, roughly 80% of the topics fell within the terms of reference. So we had a lot of information to work with. And the remaining issues, as I kind of might have referred to earlier, are generally concerned with, environmental management and water allocation policies out west. And people also commented on how the New South Wales government should actually go out carrying out the review. So people were really keen to be involved, be consulted, have a say. And also keen to make sure that we actually assess some of the proposals that we put forward and understand the implications of any changes we make to the licence itself. We received another 16 submissions to the review following the release of the draft report, which was in late May this year. I think in summary, the recommendations, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but generally well received. I think, but it's fair to say there were some calls probably from community members, probably in this region, and environmental groups to fast track some of the proposals. Probably some concerns there that we weren't just acting and that we were not actually getting some direct outcomes for the environment from what we're proposing at this stage. Okay, so what did we hear? We heard a lot, like I mentioned earlier, but we were able to, summarise them up, group them up into some key themes. I think Snowy Hydro itself thinks the licence is relatively fit for purpose, and it identified some things it would like tweaked, and they were mostly related to releases to the Murray-Darling Basin. But what else did we hear from the community? It's probably fair to say that a lot of the stakeholders didn't think it was necessarily fit for purpose. They wanted some change. It's concerns that the Snowy scheme itself lacks transparency. It's opaque. It's a black box essentially. We don't get much insight into how it operates and how releases and how releases are made and when they're going to be made. Heard the licence is quite complex. We made some changes in 2011 in response to, was at the end of the Millennium Drought, and quickly followed by significant, large flooding. And we made some changes to try and improve the effectiveness of the licence. There are concerns, I think, among many people that those changes tended to maybe benefit Snowy Hydro or were actually ineffective in actually achieving outcomes that we were seeking. We heard calls from the community for more avenues to input into decision making. There was concerns about New South Wales government's implementation of outcomes from the Snowy Water Inquiry, and there's just a general feel that the licence favours electricity generation over environmental and water releases or agricultural interests, I think. Okay, so what have we proposed? So we released our response, or preliminary response to the issues raised by Snowy Hydro and stakeholders in a draft report back in May, 30th of May, and we opened that up for public exhibition over a 6-week period. In summary, what we're proposing is some administrative fix-up, tidy-ups to the licence and a work plan. We've scoped out what we think are the most important issues for people, and we've identified a range of, or a number of investigations which we think will result in better ways of managing environmental water that sits and is stored in the scheme and released, and also better ways to actually use that water for both agricultural and electricity generation purposes as well. We're also proposing some enhancements to how water is managed generally within the scheme by governments. Get onto, I guess, some specific proposals, but like I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on the proposals we put forward in relation to environmental flows. Okay, so we got the administrative. So the licence itself, it actually places some administrative obligations on Snowy Hydro in carrying out its business. The administrative proposals really respond to issues around the lack of transparency, information sharing, consultation, and also there's some redundant provisions and errors in the licence which we also fix up. So it's fair to say issues around transparency was a big one for people. It was raised in nearly half of the submissions to the review overall, and indicated to us that it was a real priority to try and see if we can gain some inroads there. People were concerned that there was a real lack of visibility, like I mentioned before, about how much water is available at any one time in the environmental accounts, including the Snowy account. There's no access to special, water agreements or water accounting agreements that governments make behind closed doors. There's no access to data, and also the annual water operating plan, which I think maybe Graham mentioned earlier, is only actually available to a select few. So there's no visibility to, how the scheme is going to be putting out water. And ultimately what this does is actually hinder public scrutiny on how Snowy Hydro and the government really manages the water. And so how we're proposing to deal with this is actually obliging Snowy Hydro to prepare a public version, or public-facing annual water operating plan. And I think it's worthwhile noting that there's actually a lot of information. It's just spread out over a lot of different mediums, different websites, etc. It's not really collated into one spot, so it's hard to find. But there is also a lot of information that isn't made publicly available. Things like environmental water accounting data, and like what I mentioned earlier, some of the issues. We're also proposing there just to capture some existing practices that Snowy Hydro and the governments have in place, and also reduce some redundant provisions and fix some errors. Okay, so Snowy Hydro's obligations to release environmental water are contained in Schedule 3 of the licence, and Schedule 3 essentially just codifies the agreements made in the Snowy, the outcomes of the Snowy watering inquiry. Obligations of the River Murray increase flows as well are also spread across the Schedule 4. It also includes Schedule 4 for RMIF. It also includes the recent agreement made, or 2011 changes made to RMIF, which actually provided environmental managers a little bit more flexibility over access to that volume of water. And so we're proposing actually three investigations, I guess for want of a better word, into improving how environmental water is delivered down the Snowy and the Murray rivers. So the first one, we're proposing to finalise the Mwamba investigation. This one's a little embarrassing because we actually committed to doing this in the 5-year review, which is now 10 years ago. And it's obviously a long-running issue of which many of you know more about it than I do. For those that don't, the proposal is to release Snowy environmental water down the Moambe River or over the Moambe Weir. The idea here is that it will introduce some natural variability into the flow regime by introducing or reintroducing the Moambe River as a natural headwater. We did get partway around delivering, I think, the review or the investigation. I think there's been a fair bit of work done on the environmental benefits, but what's missing and what we want to wrap up to be able to enable a proper cost-benefit analysis is a review of probably the costs, essentially. And what are the socio-economic benefits and costs and the cultural costs of doing this? And so the idea is to pull all the science together, collate that, synthesise that, do a couple more assessments and be able to provide to government the costs and benefits of actually delivering this proposal. We're also proposing some investigations into whether or not we can increase flexibility for delivering Snowy River increased flows from Jindabyne Dam. Numerous stakeholders, particularly in the second round of submissions, I think really called for more flexibility to be able. I think maybe Graham mentioned earlier, and maybe Terry, we have to have a plan in place, months and months and months in advance. And that doesn't happen anywhere else, generally. You have to put a plan in place, but the order can kind of be placed during the year based on seasonal conditions. And so I've had a lot of experience in other water supply systems, and there's a lot of expertise around, and river operation experience around to be able to actually, feed into provide some really useful input, I think, into seeing whether or not we can actually introduce some of that flexibility in tools like being able to carry over water from one year to the next was identified as something that might be quite useful, and also being able to actually place orders or change the flow pattern within a year based on what the season's actually looking like. So that's another thing we're committing to looking at. And River Murray increased flow, so we're also proposing to review those changes that I mentioned before to the licence, which granted environmental managers more flexibility to call out that water. Some stakeholders have claimed that the flexibility that we granted didn't go far enough, and that the trigger as it currently stands is actually impeding environmental outcomes in the Murray River. Snowy Hydro, though, on the other hand, actually is claiming that the trigger is too low, and it doesn't actually give it a big enough buffer for its own commercial operations. We think the review provides a really good opportunity to kind of look at these 2011 variations, check whether or not they're actually meeting their intent, because the intent was to get environmental outcomes. It was part of the negotiated outcomes of that review. We want to test whether or not different operating scenarios or climate change or climate might impact those outcomes, and whether or not there may be other ways we can do it. And we're also proposing some administrative amendments to remove some redundant provisions from the licence itself, and those relate to things like the construction of outlet works at Jindabyne Dam, Tantangara Dam, and yeah, so we'll get to, I plan on talk about implementation a little bit later, but yeah, the idea, we're going to put timing around them. So we want to knock them off in a couple of years. Yep. Okay, so we're also proposing some changes to how, oversight of snowy water management within the region as well. So this was, I think it's fair to say many of the submissions, and many of the, like I mentioned before, there's 20%, roughly 20% of the issues that were raised fell outside of the terms of reference. A lot of those were related to how New South Wales government and Victorian Commonwealth governments have gone about implementing, the outcomes of the snowy watering inquiry. And the fact there were so many issues raised outside the terms of reference indicated to us that and we were fairly clear up front about what the terms of reference were, indicated to us that, you know, there probably is a real lack of a vehicle for people to kind of actually raise their issues and get heard. And so we're using not only the review process to actually, you know, demonstrate that we have heard these issues, but also maybe put in place where we can some, I guess, governance, I wouldn't say reforms, but improvements, whereby those issues can actually be considered and potentially dealt with by senior decision makers. And so what we're proposing to do to help that at this stage is set up a senior officials committee. There's one in the Murray-Darling Basin called the Basin Officials Committee. It's essentially the most highest level water bureaucrats from the various jurisdictions sit on that committee and make decisions. They're just below ministers. Proposing to do a similar thing here. One did exist a couple of years back, but it kind of lost momentum. Proposing to do a similar thing here for the Snowy, and it'd be made up of partner Snowy Water Initiative governments, Victorian, New South Wales, and Commonwealth governments. And that's something not only, you know, stakeholders have been calling for, some coordination, but also government, so Victorian government and Commonwealth government have also been advocating for this type of, I guess, group to get together to make, you know, to be able to provide some strategic advice and also help integrate, I guess, management activities. And so we think that proposal, alongside I guess the recently established Snowy Advisory Committee, and also the fact that, you know, the reform where the Office of Environment and Heritage is also taking over responsibility for Snowy environmental water planning, which will also, I guess they've probably got closer links to communities than maybe the centralised Department of Industry does. And so we think those three kind of initiatives combined will help provide a voice and I guess an avenue for some of the issues from communities to be considered. And I mentioned earlier, one of the other key terms of reference of the review was what's called the performance review. And we committed in the draft report, we didn't quite get around to it for the draft report, to carry out this performance review or actually engage an independent group to do it on our behalf. And that was in recognition mainly that, you know, the department itself is actually, you know, administers the licence, and so it's probably not really that appropriate to kind of review it ourselves. It also provided, we thought, an avenue too to consider some of the issues that were raised around implementation of the licence. So there was some concerns around how the Snowy Montane Rivers Increased Flows program had been delivered. It's not quite hitting the targets that were set in the SWEOID. And there was also a specific issue around the spill of Snowy River Increased Flows back in March 2011, of which 8 gigalitres of the spill was actually accounted from a water accounting perspective. It was actually credited, or debited, I should say, sorry, from Snowy River Increased Flows water account. So we've asked the panel, so we've actually engaged the panel, and we've engaged Alluvium Consulting to actually convene and manage the panel on our behalf, and which consists of a person called David Winfield, who's overseeing it, Gary Smith, and also mental blank. I'll get there later. But anyway, three people, and they've got experience in bulk water accounting, environmental management, and regulatory, and regulation. It's looking at three things: Snowy Hydro's assessment of compliance, which is done. It's looking at how we, like I said before, implemented increased flows programs. And it's also taking a broad look at the systems and high-level systems and frameworks that we've got in place to be able to ensure and demonstrate that actually Snowy Hydro and ourselves are doing the right thing. Like I said, it's a black box, and so we thought this would help, you know, if we are doing the right thing, you know, improve public confidence. If we're not, receive some recommendations so that we can start, you know, that we can get there and improve. The results of this review will feed into, and our response to the review as well will feed into the final report. And at this stage, I think we're committed to making the review report public as well with everything else. And on to implementation. So the draft report includes essentially a placeholder for implementation. It was something that people were really keen to see. Didn't want to just make recommendations and then move on and never deliver them. So we will include a plan, essentially. It'll have 3 distinct phases. We're proposing to we're proposing to make initial variations to the licence now, or following the recommendations, will be rolled out next year. It'll set out a work plan for these investigations I talked to earlier, and it will also outline when we're going to start to, set up this new senior officials committee. All 3 phases will run concurrently, and with an aim of finishing it off by 2020. That's what was proposed in the draft report anyway. The implementation plan will also include details on how we propose to, manage the project, but also consult on the project as well, because we acknowledge that, once the review's done, it's not the last time we should be speaking to people. We'll continue to speak to people as we roll out these investigations, because it's important. And like I said, hope to finish it all off by 2020. And that's it. Like I mentioned earlier, we're planning on finishing the review up this year. So in a couple of months' time, we're just finalising it now. I'd personally like to thank those of you who have made the effort, in the past couple of years and previously to input to the review. I know it takes a lot of time, and it's not everyone's business. It's what I do, but it's not what everyone else does. So I really appreciate the effort that people have gone to. And I really look forward to kind of continue working with, this community. On this project, and also on implementing some of its recommendations. So thanks. I think I've been telling people when I go around, this is my job. The review's my job, and so you can contact me if you want to talk about it. Details up there. And the review itself, there's a page on the Snowy Water Licence on the Department of Industry's website where the submissions and the draft report and supporting material is also provided, so go take a look. But yeah, that's it.